Chapter 17.
Have you ever heard of a laboratory called NIMH?
Nicodemus asked quietly. They had spent the time since Margaret's outburst talking about homes. The valley, the city where Nicodemus had been born, Margaret's home. They talked about what it would be like when she returned, and how much the rats would miss her, and Arthur too. I don't think so. Margaret had the feeling Nicodemus was about to tell her something important.
It's a place where they do experiments to learn more about how animals and people think. It's in a city not far from yours.
How do you know about it? Nicodemus paused.
I was there once, I and 8 others.
It took a moment for Margaret to understand. You were in charge of the experiment?
No,
Oh, you were in a cage. The last part of the sentence came out in a whisper. The thought was too awful to be said out loud. He nodded.
the experiment was run by a scientist, Dr. Schultz. We were given special shots to make us more intelligent. We learned a great deal, and from what we learned, we managed to escape. We fled in a group, ending up first at a farm and later at Thorn Valley. We left the farm for our own reasons, but we found out just before we did that Dr. Schultz was still looking for us. That was 3 years after we'd escaped.
He must have wanted to find you really bad. Margaret looked at Nicodemus. She had the feeling there was something else he was trying to tell her. And then, suddenly, she understood. He's still looking for you? She said slowly.
Yes, and he'll continue for the rest of his life.
Why?
Because we're the missing piece in a puzzle he spent years trying to solve. Without us, his life's work will remain unfinished.
But he won't find you, Margaret exclaimed.
He'd never look.
He'd never look in the valley unless someone told him. She stopped. Oh, she said. Nicodemus nodded slowly. I'll never tell. Never.
Keeping a secret can be hard.
But I will. And I'll talk to Artie too. He hardly ever says anything anyway.
It's going to be hard,
Nicodemus said.
Hard and lonely. I know you'll do the best you can, but don't feel bad if...
Margaret shook her head. I won't tell. She felt a glaze of tears against her eyes. Never! Nicodemus promised the children they would have a guide to help them find their way home. They should leave by the end of the week before the weather got colder. The journey would be hard, but not as hard as being lost, because they would know where they were going and would have food. It would take them 3 days to reach a house where someone could call their parents to come and get them.
That is, if the weather's good. If it rains, it will take longer. Rain is tough going for someone my age.
Margaret was only half listening. Something was bothering her. It was as if their departure had been planned before she ever opened her mouth. Would you have sent us away even if we wanted to stay? Nicodemus met her gaze sadly.
You couldn't have survived here over the winter. There might have been enough food, just enough, but we couldn't have built a shelter that would keep you warm. Justin and I talked about it, of course. Then, too, there was the
secret.
That's right.
So, it wasn't anything I did or Artie did?
Certainly not. We've accomplished so much with your help. Arthur, of course, is a different story.
Nicodemus smiled.
It's been a pleasure to get to know you both.
You know, Artie's really changed since he's been here. At home, he never talked. My mom was going crazy worrying about him with that and the asthma too. But here, he sort of woke up.
Yes, I've noticed, and Christopher's mentioned it too.
The way Margaret felt before she asked the next question made her realize how much closer she felt to Artie. There was something about the way he'd been lately. Not the trouble he'd caused, but the way he walked around with a kind of slap-happy grin on his face. That made her feel really good, and she didn't want that to go away. Do you think they'll ever see each other again?
I think so, though I'm not sure when. There's a lot of planning to do. We have a long trip ahead of us.
Margaret thought she hadn't heard right. We? He nodded.
I'm going to be your guide.
But you have trouble walking. Even if I carry you over the mountain, you might not be able to get back on your own.
I'm not going to come back.
Oh, no. What?
I'll explain later.
And that was all Nicodemus would say. She walked back to her hut to look for Arthur. On the way, she passed Brendan, who was digging parsnips. He waved and called to her. She smiled, but she couldn't help thinking, he doesn't know I'm leaving. Nobody knows except Nicodemus. Arthur wasn't at the hut, nor was he at the flat rock where they'd started threshing, nor sitting by the pond. She started up the path toward the mountain and saw, in the distance, Arthur and Christopher meandering through the meadow. Christopher was sitting on the boy's shoulder. Goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace surrounded them like a yellow and white blanket. Margaret took a deep breath. She wondered if Artie would ever be this happy again. She told him after dinner, when they were sitting together in the hut. Arthur was playing with his willow whistle. Do you remember the toys in your bedroom at home? Your Mickey Mouse doll, your plastic golf set? Arthur looked at her intently. He nodded. Would you like to play with them again? Would you like to have hamburgers and candy bars and ice cream? Would you like to see Bambi and Dumbo on the VCR? Arthur couldn't think about those things. Mommy, he whispered. You're going to see Mommy and Daddy soon, Artie. In a few days, we're going home. Arthur just sat there staring, as if he didn't know what to think. Then he started crying, but softly, not the loud wailing Margaret had expected. He clutched his whistle to his chest. Maybe you can take it with you to remind you of Christopher and the valley, but we won't be able to talk about them to anybody else, not ever. It would be dangerous for them. Arthur nodded as if he understood. He cried until he fell asleep. In the morning, Christopher could tell something was wrong. Arthur looked as if he'd been crying, and he didn't grin when Christopher jumped into his lap. What's wrong, Artie? Mommy. Do you miss your mommy? Try to think about the fun things we're going to do today. You and I are going to build a little dam. Would you like that? Artie, go home. It's too far, and you might get lost. Remember when you and Margaret were lost, and you had to... You come too. I can't, and you can't either, because it's too far. Christopher didn't see Margaret, who had come up the path with a bowl of water in each hand, but she had heard the conversation. He is going home, Christopher. We're leaving Friday. What are you talking about? She didn't try to keep the sadness out of her voice. We don't fit here. Not forever. We would freeze in the winter without a house, And in the meantime, we'd use up all the food. We're just too big. You're not. Audie's not. We are too. Even Nicodemus thinks so. Nicodemus. Christopher spoke the name as if it were a bad word. How could he say that? He didn't really. Not until I told him I wanted to go back anyway. It was my idea. But that's crazy. You'll get lost again. And you need a guide and food. We have a guide. Margaret was firm. It's all set. Like I said, we're leaving Friday, and Nicodemus is leaving with us. Chapter 18. The next day, Nicodemus called a meeting and told the rats the news. He named Justin and Beatrice the new leaders and asked everyone to help them during the months after his departure.
The scientists at NIMH thought they had made us immortal,
He said sadly.
but they were wrong about that. Each of us will die.
Raxo shook his head. He couldn't think about that, not with Nicodemus standing there full of life. But the old rat continued.
Ever since I was little, I've dreamed of seeing the ocean. Lately, that dream has become more powerful. Sometimes at night, I think I can hear the water splashing against the sand and the seagulls calling. I smell the salt air, but when I wake up, I'm here and the dream is gone. I had given up on it. Then I realized that Margaret and Arthur needed a guide to cross the mountain. If I were that guide, Margaret could carry me. By the time I reached the Fitzgibbons farm, the hardest part of my journey would be over.
I don't want you to go. A small rat standing near the front spoke suddenly, as if she couldn't contain herself any longer.
I want to go,
His voice was grave.
but I will miss you all.
Will you come back? Nicodemus didn't answer the question. Instead, he patted one of the baby rats on the head as if it were just another day. Raxo closed his eyes tight, as if that would make the whole scene disappear. Nicodemus wouldn't leave. He couldn't. Raxo needed him. And for Margaret and Arthur to go at the same time, it was as if the world were being turned upside down. But as bad as it was for Raxo, it was worse for Christopher. Raxo knew what it was like to lose someone you really cared about. He remembered when he'd found out his father had died. All he could do was lie on the ground and cry. So he stayed nearby while Christopher wept about Arthur, and when his friend shouted angrily that it was unfair, that they should have listened to him, he didn't argue. This is all wrong, Christopher shouted. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Raxo listened. I found Arthur. I'm the one who should decide what happens to him. He's mine. Raxo listened. I'm going too, Christopher shrieked. I'm going with them. I'm not staying here by myself. A bit later, he opened his eyes and looked at Raxo. I don't want to leave here, he sobbed. I've always lived here. My friends are here. This is my home. You don't have to leave, Raxo said gently. We don't want you to. Christopher and Arthur were inseparable for the next 2 days. They slept together in the hut, Christopher curled in a ball on Arthur's chest. They waded in the brook, picked wildflowers, ate bread and honey, looked for surprises under the oak tree. They held 3 meetings of the brave explorers. The first 2 were about what to do that day and what to have for supper. Christopher tried to act like nothing had changed, but it was hard. Twice he blinked back tears, and Arthur looked stricken too. But the third meeting was different. When Christopher called it to order, his voice was almost cheery. "Agenda item number 1, he announced. Trip." Artie waited. "I'm not talking about your trip, Christopher." "I'm not talking about your trip," Christopher said. Artie waited. "I'm talking about another trip, because I've made a decision, Artie, a very grown-up decision. I've decided that no matter how I feel about it, I'm going to have to say goodbye to you tomorrow. Raxo and I talked, and I realized I wouldn't want to be away from my mom and dad forever either. Not only that, but the winters here are cold. Raxo said children wear thick jackets in cold winter, and we don't have one for you. But I couldn't stand the idea that I would never see you again." Christopher gulped. Like I told you, I'd always dreamed about having a little brother. And then I found you. I can't just say goodbye forever. And that's what the trip is about." "What?" Arthur's eyes were big. "I'm coming to visit you in the city. Raxo's coming with me, so I won't get lost. I'll come when the leaves change color." Arthur clapped his hands. "I'm going to tell Nicodemus tonight. Well, I'm going to ask him, really, but I'm pretty sure he'll say it's okay." Arthur started jumping up and down. He couldn't wait for Christopher to come to his house. "The meeting's not adjourned yet." Christopher waited while Arthur sat back down. "We still have to vote on this. Now, raise your hand if you want me to visit you. Let's see. That's 1 vote, and I make 2. Anyone opposed? No? The ayes have it. Hooray!" Before Christopher got the chance to go see Nicodemus, he got a message that Nicodemus wanted to see him in his office. To his surprise, Raxo was in the office too. Nicodemus gestured for them to sit down.
"I've talked to Margaret about Nim," he began. "She's volunteered to keep our identity a secret."
"I think she will," Raxo said eagerly. "Kids love secrets. Remember last year when I taught everyone the backward code? All the kids."
Christopher shot a glance at Raxo that said, "Pipe down."
"Secrets can be fun when they're shared," Nicodemus said, "but they can also be lonely."
"Margaret will have Auntie to talk to, and we can help her make up a great story about what happened to her." Raxo waved his paws. "Like how she saved Artie from bobcats and rattlesnakes, how she fed him beetles and tadpoles and worms to keep him alive. She'll be like Tarzan."
"That might work for a little while, but I think people will question her story."
"Then she can make up something else. She can say she met a lonely wolf, and he took them into his cave and fed them. But they missed their parrot, so they decided to come back."
Nicodemus shook his head.
"I think her story needs to be simple. I'll try to work it out with her on the trip, but telling a story and sticking to it can be hard."
Christopher sat up straight. He started to open his mouth to say something important, but Nicodemus silenced him.
"Just a minute. I have a proposal to make, and I don't think it will be easy."
He looked hard at both of them.
"I think the 2 of you should visit the children. The visit will have to be brief, just a day. You can't take the risk of being caught or seen with them, but you'll be able to let them know we still care about them. And if they haven't been able to keep the secret, we'll know."
Ah,
Christopher stared.
that was my idea."
"Good. So you want to go.
Yes.
What about you, Raxo?
Raxo snatched his beret off his head and dusted it off, as if the trip were starting today.
Certainly. I know how to get around in the city, and I'll take good care of Christopher.
Christopher wanted to shout, "Nobody has to take care of me," but he noticed Nicodemus looking right at him. He swallowed.
You're to bring a report back to Justin and Beatrice.
We will.
You'll be careful, won't you?
Nicodemus looked at them fondly.
I won't be around to help if you get into trouble.
"We'll be careful." They got up, but Raxo couldn't just leave.
I'll always remember you, Nicodemus, and I'll miss you a lot.
"Me too," Christopher whispered. Nicodemus didn't answer, but he put a paw on each of their heads. Christopher left the office feeling sad and happy and excited and scared and already lonely. They left the next morning. Someone had fashioned a wicker basket for Margaret to wear on her back. It held food and a bed for Nicodemus. All the rats watched as she placed him in the basket and fastened it on. Margaret wasn't sure what to say. Leaving the rats felt like leaving everything she had. Her house that she'd built herself, her wooden plate, her pine needle mattress, her meadow filled with flowers, her life. The rats crowded around her legs, making her feel like Paul Bunyan. She gripped Arthur's hand tight. "Thanks for taking care of us," she said weakly.
Things things didn't start off so well between us, but they ended up better,
Isabella said.
We'll miss you.
Margaret nodded. She wanted to say, "I don't want to go."
Thanks for moving the nest,
Isabella added.
and for helping with the dam, and cutting the wheat, and everything else.
Margaret's throat ached. She tried to memorize the picture of the rats standing by the nest, the garden stretching behind them, the mountains beyond that. She took a step. Then it hit Arthur that he wouldn't see Christopher again for a long, long time. He sank to the ground. "Get up, Artie." He shook his head. "You have to get up," Margaret said. "We're leaving." Arthur pointed to Christopher. "He can't come. I told you that already, remember? We're going home." Arthur began to cry, and then Margaret began to cry too. The tears rolled down her face. Arthur wasn't going to walk away and pretend that it was okay to be leaving, because it wasn't okay. It was awful. It was Christopher who saved the day. He climbed into Arthur's lap and stood up on his hind legs so that his furry face was staring right into Arthur's face. He licked Arthur right on the nose. Arthur couldn't keep on crying while he was being licked, so he began to laugh. Christopher whispered something in his ear. Arthur hiccuped and wiped his eyes. And then they went through the meadow and over the log, across the stream, and up the stony path to the mountain. Chapter 19. "Tell me what to say," Margaret whispered. She whispered because it was dark and Arthur was asleep by the campfire just a few feet away. They had walked all day, crossing the peak of the mountain in mid-afternoon. They had chosen a knoll beside a clump of cedars for their camp. There had been sandwiches made by Isabella for dinner, but Arthur began nodding off before his was finished.
Begin with the things that really happened,
Nicodemus said.
You must stay as close to the truth as you can, without mentioning us. Remember that a lot of what you ate and your shelter grew naturally in the valley.
We decided to go for a walk together while Mom was taking a nap. We crossed over a hill and were following an old logging road when we suddenly saw a bear. We started running, and that's when we got lost. Nicodemus nodded. So she told the whole story as if it had really happened. Nicodemus asked her questions, and she tried to think up answers that fit. Then he questioned the answers. It was hard. There were always things that Margaret hadn't thought about, like how she got a fire started and how she knew which plants were poisonous. She got frustrated. I'm not sure I can do this. What if they don't believe me?
Just repeat what you said before, and be careful not to change your story. That would arouse suspicion.
Nicodemus sighed.
I don't feel good about this, but I'm afraid the well-being of the others depends on it.
I'll do it, Margaret said, and I'll talk to Artie about it tomorrow. For breakfast, there were peanut butter sandwiches with raisins in them, and plums and apple tarts. Nicodemus measured where the sun came over the cliff before he told Margaret which way to go. They walked all day, crossing a ridge and coming down into a thick wood. That night, they camped in a little valley. Margaret wanted to make a fire, but Nicodemus said no, that they were only 5 miles from a ranger's lookout tower. Margaret felt funny, knowing that another human was that close. She wondered how'd she feel seeing people again. She shivered. Before dinner, she told Arthur the story she planned to tell when they got back, that they'd been frightened by the bear and wandered away over the mountain. They'd lived in a cave and then built a hut while they waited to be found. They'd lived off berries and fish and wild grapes and birds' eggs, and she'd concocted a medicine for Arthur made from herbs that grew along the banks of the stream. After a time, they'd given up hope of being found. They'd packed food and started walking. After days and days, they'd come upon a house. Remember, we're not going to tell anyone about the rats, Margaret said. I'm not going to tell anyone about anything, Arthur thought. He missed Christopher already. We don't want anyone to know about the rats, Margaret repeated. Get it, Artie? Arthur nodded. He wondered what was going to happen. Margaret fixed supper. She tried not to think about the fact that this was the last evening she would spend with Nicodemus. Leaving the valley had been bad enough. Having him with them had made it easier. But tomorrow he would leave too. They would be found and go back home. Raxo and Christopher might visit, but Nicodemus would become a memory. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the food and set it on clean, broad leaves, then dipped water from the stream to go with it.
You're nervous,
Nicodemus said. Not nervous, she snapped. Hungry. But she wasn't hungry. The food tasted like sawdust, and swallowing was painful. Margaret couldn't look Nicodemus in the face. She couldn't think of anything to say. She looked down at her hands and saw her fingernails, black with grime. When kids came to school dirty, the teacher sent a note home to their parents. But Nicodemus didn't care about dirt. He cared about adventures, dreams, and feelings. After Artie fell asleep, they sat together in the dark. Nicodemus seemed to know what she'd been thinking.
It's going to be a change, isn't it?
He asked softly. She shrugged. I'll get used to it. I have no choice.
Maybe you do,
he answered pleasantly.
When I first met you, you wanted to go back.
That was before I got used to being on my own. I liked building my house and working for my food. I even liked climbing the cliff. After I did it, that is, it made me feel... She hesitated, trying to find the right word. Real.
You were real before that.
I know, but it didn't feel like it. Nicodemus turned toward her.
This will be the first time I've gone off on my own since before NIM. I don't know what it will be like.
Margaret was surprised. Are you scared?
Yes?
Me too, Margaret said. They stretched out on the ground beside Arthur. Looking up through the trees, Margaret could see a crescent of moon hanging in the dark. Nicodemus, she whispered,
Yes?
the moon is getting smaller. In a week or so, it won't be there at all.
It will be there. You just won't be able to see it.
Is it true what you said about yourself? That you're going? She couldn't bring herself to finish the question.
To die?
He paused.
Yes.
I don't want you to. He sighed. I don't, she said again, but he didn't answer. Before he left, Nicodemus showed them the way, down the hill to an old logging road, then right. Then he went off into the brush, his cane in one paw. For a while, she and Arthur just stood there, staring at the spot where he disappeared. Margaret held Arthur's hand tight, and they started down the road. After a while, they came to a farmhouse. They climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door. A boy about her age answered it. He stared at her as if she were from another planet. Margaret was suddenly aware of her grimy, raggedy sweatshirt and the streaks of dirt on Arthur's face. The boy looked as if he were about to slam the door. Could I use the telephone? Margaret asked. Her voice felt thin. Mom! The boy shouted. He didn't take his eyes off Margaret. A woman in a flowered house dress appeared behind the boy. Her face changed when she saw them. I'd like to use the telephone, Margaret repeated. We've been lost, and I want to call my parents. You can't be the two. The woman's eyes traveled from Margaret's face down to her shoes, then over Arthur, head to foot. Heavens! She exclaimed, and in the same breath, Billy, run fetch your dad. She opened the door and herded Margaret and Arthur inside. Come in, come in. The room was bright and pretty, with floral chair covers and a red rocker beside the wood stove. But all Margaret could think was, I'm in a house again, where people live. Come sit here, the woman said. Sit down. I'll get you something to eat. She gestured to a wooden table with a pitcher of flowers on it. Then the door opened, and a man in denim overalls came striding in, the boy at his heels. He towered over the children, staring down at them with steel blue eyes. But his voice was gentle. Your name? Margaret Livingstone. And you? His name's Arthur, Margaret said quickly. Where did you come from? From the woods, out that way. We got lost a long time ago, and we couldn't find our way back to the campsite. I know, the man interrupted hastily. I know all about that, but we thought. He stopped and looked over at his wife. We'd given up hope. We were gone a long time, Margaret murmured. I have cookies for you, the woman said, and milk, here, on the table. They were Oreo cookies. Margaret's hands were shaking. The man dialed the telephone. Sheriff Jones, right away. He couldn't stop looking at them. Yes, it's Paul Fitzgibbon. Those children who were lost. Yes, in the North Woods. They're here. They're at my place. I'm sure. In a moment, he hung up the phone. Sheriff's coming out, he told Margaret. He wants to see you with his own eyes before he calls your folks. Poor things. The woman stood beside Margaret and put one hand on her shoulder. What a nightmare they've been through. Something about the warm hand touching her made Margaret feel funny, and before she knew it, she was crying, the tears streaming down her face and onto the front of her dirty sweatshirt. Arthur sat at the table, his eyes like little owl eyes, and watched Margaret cry.